Thank you very much. Let me at the outset thank the organizers for inviting me to speak. I hope to convince you that long-term thionamide therapy is effective for Graves' disease. Let me just start with a straw poll to find out how many friends I have in the audience. Just assume for a second that you all have Graves' disease. How many of you would prefer to take an effective tablet or would want to radiate yourself or have your thyroid cut out? If you want to go for radiation yourself or want to have surgery and remove your thyroid, can you please put up your hands, please? So I can see that I have lots of friends in the audience, and I hope to deepen my friendship over the course of this talk. So we have three main ways of trying to approach management of hypothyroidism. You can either block the synthesis using thionamide, so you can ablate or remove the gland. The trend really the world over now is in favor of using thionamide therapy. Japan, Asia, India, Europe have all been converts for a very long period of time. There was only one outlier, and there's no prizes for guessing who that outlier is. It was the United States. But even they, since 2005, have essentially come over, have been persuaded. I've just shown you data from the US to say that from 2005 onwards, endocrinologists in the US are voting with their feet as far as radioactive iodine and surgery are concerned, and thionamide therapy is the preferred treatment there in terms of Graves' disease. And the reasons for this are not very hard to find. In an era when we are debating the cardiovascular deleterious effects of subclinical hypothyroidism, why would you want to induce overt hypothyroidism? And that's what happens if you use radioactive iodine. Almost all patients develop hypothyroidism at some point. I just want to make sure that when I speak of antithyroid drugs, I'm essentially just speaking of methimazole or carbimazole, because outwith of very special situations, most of us are not using PTU, and therefore the side effects that are usually associated with PTU are irrelevant to this debate to a large extent. And that's the slide which essentially tells you that most of us, when we use thionamides, are essentially talking about methimazole or carbimazole. So ATDs are a very versatile option. Most of patients tend to prefer tablets, often younger patients who have concerns about radioactive iodine or surgery. In severe eye disease, it can be used. It's a lifesaver in thyroid storm. There's nothing else that you can do when a patient comes in at that point. And it's really the only therapy that you can use at any trimester of pregnancy. So very versatile. But in addition to that, it also addresses the primary pathology behind why somebody develops Graves' disease, the high levels of thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin. You can see here that if you use thionamides, you can reduce the TSH receptor antibodies, which is not what happens if you give radioactive iodine, at least transiently for the first 6 to 8 months. You do have a rise in TSH receptor antibodies. So ATDs may have a beneficial immunosuppressive role, and some studies have suggested that this is an effect of the drug itself. It's very effective. I mean, if you use methimazole or carbimazole, you can essentially induce euthyroidism as quickly as within 3 to 4 weeks. So there's no question of efficacy here, really. I want to deal with this issue of toxicity, which I'm sure my good friend will be referring to later on in his talk. We all have minor toxicities. Any drug which is worth its salt will have some of these. But even if you look at something like agranulocytosis, the incidence is vanishingly small, 0.1 to 0.15%. And if you look at, this is a cohort study which has looked at 50,000 patients with Graves' disease, of which those people who used ATDs, 55 patients developed agranulocytosis. But the most important thing in that last point is that 54 of them recovered with appropriate measures. So this is perhaps not a highly problematic issue that we need to be frightened about, and it can be managed as many other rare side effects are managed. So the incidence of agranulocytosis is somewhere between 0.1 to 0.3%, and therefore that has to be put in perspective when we are evaluating the role of thionamides in treating hyperthyroidism. Methimazole is an excellent agent which has got a long half-life, single dose, and if you are sensible about the dose, you can essentially avoid even the toxicities that we mentioned. I'm sure that this is a slide which will be alluded to by my very good friend later on, that perhaps the remission rates using antithyroid drugs are not where you expect them to be or where you would like them to be over a short period of time. But I hope to convince you that the data in terms of long-term follow-up of these patients is completely different. So this is a study published from Japan in the Endocrine Journal. 549 patients followed up for greater than 8 years. Mean time to remission was around, median time was about 6.8 years. And it required almost 5 years of treatment to have a negative TBII in 80%. So the authors concluded that use of ATDs for 3 to 6 years can achieve a better rate of remission. So perhaps we're missing the point that the problem is not with the drug itself, it's the problem that we're not using the drug for long enough to achieve what you want to achieve. So therefore, telling patients that you're only allowed to use antithyroid drugs for 2 years and then you need to do something else might not be the right approach, and there might be something else that you can offer these patients. Here's a study which has looked at 423 Graves' disease patients who relapsed. 124 of them went on to antithyroid drugs at low dose, and 114 went on to radioactive iodine, and they looked at what happened. And the outcomes of this study are pretty startling. Thyroid dysfunction was much more common with radioactive iodine. Euthyroidism was much more common if you used methimazole. Graves' orbitopathy, as expectedly, was more common in the radioactive iodine group. And the quality of life was similar in both groups. The authors concluded that long-term low-dose methimazole is an option for many patients. This is perhaps the only randomized trial which has looked at these these differing therapies head-to-head. This is published from the Thyroid Study Group, 48 months of follow-up. The risk of relapse in medically treated young and old adults was around 30 to 40%. But look at the relapse rate in patients who are treated with radioactive iodine. It's 21%. So perhaps radioactive iodine is not the single bullet prescriptive panacea for treating Graves' disease. And 90% of the subjects in all groups were quite satisfied with the treatment they received. Both these studies tell us that there was really not much difference in terms of quality of life based on what treatment you followed. Here's another study published from Azizi, who has done quite a bit of work on this, looking at the effect of long-term continuous methimazole treatment of hyperthyroidism and compared that with radioactive iodine. So 104 patients with recurrent hyperthyroidism went on, and you can see here that if you used radioactive iodine, almost 25 of the 51 patients were rendered hypothyroid, whereas if you used methimazole, only one of those 34 patients actually became hypothyroid, and more of them remained in the euthyroid range. But more importantly, if you looked at other parameters, you can see that serum cholesterol levels and LDL levels were better in the methimazole treated group as compared to the radioiodine group. And when they looked at BMD levels, the BMD levels were not significant, but there was a trend in favor of the methimazole group. So even in terms of markers which you would associate with cardiovascular risk, the group 1, which was using methimazole, seemed to do better. So the summary of that trial, as concluded by the authors, essentially 104 patients randomized to 10 years of follow-up, no serious complications in any of these patients. The cholesterol and LDL was lower in the methimazole group, BMD no difference, and the authors concluded that long-term continuous treatment of hyperthyroidism with methimazole is safe. The complications and expense of treatment do not exceed those of radioactive iodine therapy. The definitive meta-analysis in this area, again published by Azizi, long-term antithyroid drug treatment meta-analysis, they were able to identify 6 trials which fitted the bill all over the world. Many trials, one from China, France, Japan, US, Spain, Netherlands, whole total of around 508 patients in these trials. And essentially they concluded that long-term ATDs induce remission rates as high as 61% in adults, very low complication rates. Remission rates they calculated for each year of treatment was 16%. And if you excluded the study from China and compared all the other 5 studies and put them in the sensitivity analysis, the actual remission rates rose to 29% for every year of treatment. And the only issue that they could identify was that if you were a smoker, then you obviously kind of significantly lowered your remission rates. So long-term ATDs, what do we know so far? ATDs are convenient and do not irreversibly compromise the thyroid. Both the ATA and the ETA say that continued low-dose methimazole for longer than 12 to 18 months may be considered in those patients who prefer this approach. There's high remission rates with low rates of complications during long-term use. There's very beneficial immunosuppressive effects. You have more patients in euthyroidism and less rates of inducing hypothyroidism. You have less patients with dyslipidemia. Echo, BMD, and neuropsychology tests tend to favor methimazole therapy over radioactive iodine. They have less thyroid eye disease flare-up and less weight gain. So what else do you need to choose long-term methimazole therapy? But if you still want more evidence, here's something else, another thought to leave you with. We've known that Graves' disease can be self-limiting and can have spontaneous remissions. This is a study published as far back as 1988, where people with Graves' disease were treated with just beta blockade. And a fairly significant section of them, 8 of these 26 patients, went into spontaneous remission that continued to be in spontaneous remission 36 to 48 months after even the stoppage of beta blockers. So bear in mind that we're dealing with a disease that can go into spontaneous remission. So perhaps a controllable, self-limited disease may be best treated with a controllable and limitable therapy. And I strongly urge the House to support my contention that long-term antithyroid drug treatment is effective, safe, and it should be considered as an alternative treatment for Graves' disease. Thank you very much.